Now our next speaker will be Melisa Brieva. Melisa is professor of the architecture studio Landscape of Mass Production, theory assistant professor at Escuela de Arquitectura y Estudios Urbanos de la Universidad Torcuato Di Tella, and postgraduate professor at the master program project research at UBA. So let's welcome Melisa.
Monoculture fields, petrochemical plants, open pit mining, and commercial ports are the new global landscapes. Landscape of mass production claims them for architecture, under the hypothesis that it has the power to organize ecologies, both natural and artificial, assembling them, not being one in service of the other or being mutually attacked, but constituting conglomerates impossible to discriminate. This integration must overcome the moralistic approach of romantic ideals of nature, because ecologies are made of production and destruction, organic material and machinery, where beauty is found on the protocols that fuse them together. Synchronicities, excessive extension, hermeticity, violent concentration of energy are the values that landscape and mass production share. Through them is possible the emergence of new non-binary models. In this case, we are going to see a project from the studio Landscape of Mass Production that Santiago Miret and I teach in Universidad Torcuato Di Tella, which operates with production models in global scales from extracting processes like monoculture of corn, soybeans, and palm oil, as well as open pit mining for copper or lithium, through processes of transformation of raw material, like in petrochemical plants, and finishing with the logistics of distribution on commercial ports. We study those programs with the objective of assembling them with metropolitan parks as disciplinary models. This specific project focuses on a petrochemical pole at Jurong in Singapore as a study case. This is a small part of one of the biggest petrochemical poles in the world. As protocols, we understand the relations between systems and subsystems in order to generate a certain behavior. This is why we study protocols in recursive loops of isolation and clustering of systems. The petrochemical plant is organized in two main systems, supply and treatment, which relate to 5 subsystems, respectively docks, where the raw material arrived, storage for treatment and distribution as a second stage, water supply, which is used on the complete process of cracking, and also for filtering the waste that they produce. And last, the refinery, where the specific cracking processes occurs. As the substratum of those systems, a matrix of pipes is deployed, carrying both crude oil and their derivatives, as well as the water for security, heaters, coolers, and filtering. The protocol is organized through bands delimited by 2 perpendicular axes, one coastal and the other terrestrial. By the study of the relations embedded on the protocol, we can isolate prototypical behaviors, for instance, ways of proliferations, limit or critical points. Here we can see 2 different systems, the storage and the refinery, how they grow and relate in a certain domain, the extensive and intensive values within each system and in the protocol as a whole. That is how they can later perform in different sequences, enabling emergent assemblages. As a disciplinary model, we focus on park protocols. In this case, is the Eden project in the United Kingdom by Grimshaw. The organization consists of 3 systems, namely Circulations, island of vegetation and programs. Those programs are inside and outside the domes. And are composed also by 5 subsystems, which are main trails, the concentric paths, secondary trails, the transversal paths, the domes, buildings, and vegetation. The protocol is organized from sloping concentric axes, which are affected and transversely deformed by force vectors. These deformations generate platforms of connection between the different strips and levels. These protocols behave as a focal organization, distributing and scaling programs, domes, and trails in relation to a center at a different height than the edges. By the integration of the preceding protocols is how Cracking Park becomes a linear petrochemical park organized in longitudinal bands with respect to the coastal edge of the southern peripheral area of the city of Buenos Aires. Meanwhile, it deploys the stages of crude oil treatment along its edges. It constructs a transverse gradient towards the continental interior, consolidating instances of progressive recreation. Cracking Park seeks to colonize a field, avoiding the vision of the elements of the productive processes as objects in themselves, but using them as means to build an extensive network that carry embedded landscapes. Both on a global and in a more specific scale, all the elements of the project are under the control of a rigorous geometric protocol of location and distribution that strains simultaneously linear and focal organizations. The project works mainly with 2 apparently opposite systems, vegetation landscape on one hand and productive infrastructure on the other, stressing and integrating the qualities of both. Vegetation takes a big role within the project, becoming contaminated and contaminating productive systems, consolidating singularities at different scales, like trees being deployed and sites in regards to towers, tanks, or heaters. Cracking Park proposes circulation hierarchies that cover both the productive needs as well as recreational activities. Those paths connect as a secondary terrestrial substratum in addition with the aerial matrix of pipes. Moreover, greenhouses domes appropriate the quality produced by the towers of the refinery to generate high temperatures, taking advantage of the effect that they produce, allowing the development of tropical vegetation, for instance. While amphitheater domes create contemplation landscapes, enabling a close experience of the product transformation processes. Here is where a huge amount of raw material is transformed into insignificant quantities of derivatives. Hence, is this disproportion what produces a sense of scale to those programs. Unveiling this initially hermetic disproportion is one of the aesthetics and disciplinary interests of the project. Cracking Park is a project that acknowledges a contemporary discussion where cities can reboot their relationship with industrial processes, and even more important, with energy production protocols, not trying to get rid of them, but using them for the construction of massive disciplinary landscapes. In this sense, the architectural project can discuss with global production conglomerates and companies, as well as with metropolitan governments. A project that operates by letting be known and not by denouncing or being reactionary. An architectural organization that can handle heavy machinery as well as heavy nature by the assemblage of the vast ecology of the late Anthropocene. I would like to, of course, appreciating your attention and saying thanks to my team, which is Santiago Miret and all the students of Landscape of Mass Production on its 2017 edition, and especially to Belén Ilievich, Sushai Teja, and Victoria Rios for allowing us to share their work with you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we have our last presenter of this panel. He's Pedro Aparicio. We already seen him here on the podium, but let me tell you a little bit who he is. He's a Colombian architect and urbanist, adjunct faculty at Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia, research associate at the Harvard GSD Office for Urbanization, and co-founder partner of Altiplano, an architecture and research office based in Bogotá that works by overlapping construction techniques with geographic inquiries. Aparicio previously taught at Architecture Department of Rhode Island School of Design and has served as a visiting researcher at Rujek Center for Urban Studies in Jakarta, Indonesia, and AHO, Oslo School of Architecture and Design. Trained as an architect in Universidad de los Andes, Bogotá, Aparicio received a Fulbright scholarship for regional development and pursued a master in design studies in urbanism, landscape, and ecology from the Harvard Graduate School of Design, graduating with distinction and awarded with the Gerald McHugh Medal for the highest academic achievement. So please, let's welcome Pedro to the stage again.
Thank you, Felipe. I'll be quick and brief, considering that we're over time and there's a possibility that we'll have to leave. But no need to panic. So this presentation summarizes the work of the Harvard GSD Office for Urbanization's Airport Landscape Initiative. More than a research project, the Airport Landscape Initiative consists of a series of protocols set in place to make research applicable to the conditions in need of urban transformation. It is then a methodology for applied research for the transformation of abandoned or decommissioned airfields to new forms of urban life. In this methodology, landscape is not only presented as medium and model for urban intervention, but also as a mediator between stakeholders involved in the contemporary production of the city. The project here presented concerns the transformation of an abandoned airfield in Mendoza, Argentina, and the presentation will move in 3 parts. First, a brief preface of case studies that will provide a visual cues of the overall research question of the initiative, a second part that talks about the transformation of this case studies to a series of enrollment objects to survey and collect data through multi-stakeholder participation, and finally, a brief summary of the application of that co-produced knowledge to a set of 4 potential scenarios for the future of the Mendoza Aeroparque. So, airports have never been more central to the life of cities, yet they have remained relatively peripheral in the design discourse. Despite this, landscape architects in recent decades have reaffirmed their historic assertions about the airfield as a site of design. These are basically a collection of airfields that we've mapped around the world. There's over 1,800 decommissioned airfields for different reasons. Through a series of categories, we've selected and identified a series of projects that are already dealing with the transformation of abandoned airfields. So over the last 100 years, the world has built thousands of airports. Given the rapid growth of air travel that came alongside the great expansion of cities, many airports have since become obsolete, underutilized, or subsequently abandoned. Reasons for this include insufficient size of facilities, locations that became unfavorable for airport operations, decommissioning of military uses, and the functional obsolescence of buildings. With a database of over 1,800 decommissioned airfields, we're posing the question, what are going to be of these sites once they're no longer needed? On that order of ideas, we've revised the 5 categories of production, urbanity, succession, topography, and restoration, case studies around the world that assert the need to think about this vast and flat piece of land currently immersed within the urban fabric. And the objective of this case studies is to draw specific lessons about the way that these places have been intervened and the conditions that they have created. We've got airports in Asia, Europe, South America. Not all of them have been executed, but most of them are projects, which is an interesting distinction. We don't differentiate between projects built or unbuilt. In a way, after collecting all this information, we started to delude and analyze and generate a series of cartographies of before and after, and mapping the different programs and grounds that have been converted, and generated a new series of categories that allowed us to start generating what we called the Airfield Manual, a field guide to the transformation of abandoned airfields, which is a document addressed to stakeholders, not necessarily from the design disciplines, but stakeholders involved in the transformation of the city, to engage with its potential sites. From there, we did develop in parallel the Airfield Manual, the case of the Mendoza Aeroparque. So as we were in Mendoza, we were basically generating both documents in parallel. The city of Mendoza, Argentina presents a unique opportunity to examine the extraordinary benefits that the transformation of the commissioned airfields might bring to the city and its inhabitants. The Mendoza Aeroparque is a 72-hectare decommissioned airfield sitting at the western edge of the Andean city in a strategic position between the foothills and the high plains. The region is predominantly a desert due to low levels of precipitation. However, pre-Hispanic water management techniques engineered the land to be amenable to human life. The city's grid was designed to capture Andean snowmelt and provide an urban oasis through a system of channels called acequia. So most of you know the story of Mendoza. The acequia system has flourished, a beautiful canopy of trees, and the possibility of having public planting as well as shade, and amortiguation for earthquakes through the possibility of the runoff, of the conduction of the runoff of the Andes. This is the original document of the construction of this airfield, a series of photographs during the construction and inauguration, eventual decommission, was generated because of the lack of use and also because of the opening of a new airport. Recently, high tension lines of infrastructure has made this place unviable. We generated, as I was speaking, we generated a methodology to intervene in this project, and basically we had a series of consultations with 2 visits, one that was more about the current conditions of the airfield, and another one that was more about potential programs. What leads us to this different sets of scenarios with 3 different architecture schools, 2 municipalities, Las Heras and Ciudad Mendoza, and different experts from the Inter-American Development Bank, and to ask the question of what would be the potential uses for Mendoza, as well as site visits. This public consultation was then drawn from a series of programs that we generated from the previous case studies that set the questions of what to do with this place. In a way, we were dramatizing the condition and taking it to a fulfillment of that specific program in the complete size of the site, to then generate a discussion with all these different stakeholders of what to do. It's important to recognize or to bring to point that the surroundings of the airfield, let's say the urban fabric around its border, has different socioeconomic incomes, interests in long-term, medium-term scale projects. So in a way, this scenarios of filling the airfield with a specific program was in a way a provocation to generate a conversation. From those conversations, we decided on 2 specific ways of operating. One that is understanding the perimeter of the airfield, the other one that is understanding the interior of the airfield, and generated 4 different scenarios, from a specific scenario of low level of urbanized perimeter to a half level of urbanized perimeter to then the inverse of an urbanized interior or 50% urbanized interior. The 4 scenarios basically provide the possibility of showing different ways of accommodating, not only through gradients of time, but also of developing different programs around in the occupation of the site. Here we have the plan. The 4 strategies contemplate the mixed use of these programs that were initially mentioned, from the production of energy to the restoration of habitats, Also understanding this horizontality of the site in the still foothills of the Andes, capturing water to generate this place, but also potentially reshaping the idea of where shadow could be casted and where not. In terms of maintenance, we've seen that there's a high demand of water in the region, so basically reintroducing the possibility of the Andean foothill ecology. So all this open space that we're providing, in a way, positions that as a different type of landscape that the Mendoza situation has generated through the use of water. So it's also considering eventual lack of snowmelt, the different scenarios, then make able the possibility for mediation, as I say, landscape as a mediation of different stakeholders, one that is more towards urbanization and building, one that is more towards landscape. This is a condition that also talks about availability of resources. We're talking about 72 hectares. So having the possibility of doing this in gradients of time makes possible the incorporation of different views of different stakeholders around this place. So these 4 scenarios were then provided to the municipalities of Mendoza and Las Heras, as well as the universities and other stakeholders that have been involved in this place. So to generate potential conversations to move the project forward, instead of having considering the scale again, it be blocked, but more used as a way of understanding potential scenarios. These were a series of voices that we included in the publication, where basically we do an overflight of the airfield and incorporate these views in terms of the book form. Thank you.